right, I think we can go ahead and get started. We may have a few more people joining us, but that's okay. Okay, so hello, good afternoon. Thank you for attending today's webinar. Today we are discussing the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation. We hope you enjoyed our last webinar, which was on photo documentation. That last webinar has been recorded and it will soon be available to view on our website. We apologize for the delay, but we will be posting that shortly. The first webinar, which is an overview of all of our tax credit programs, is available to view on the webinar. So we encourage you to go back and watch that if you haven't seen it. So we'll kind of start by introducing our office and our staff. My name is Andrea McCarthy. I am the program manager for the tax credit program here with the Louisiana State Historic Preservation Office. I'll let Emily introduce herself.
Hi everyone, I am Emily Van Doren. I am a tax credit reviewer here in the office. So that means that my primary duty is reviewing all the tax credit applications that we've been discussing these past few months.
Hello everyone, my name is Erin Jones and I am another tax credit reviewer here at the SHIP office.
Hi, my name is Tristan and I'm the administrative coordinator for tax credits.
And our office is the Office of Cultural Development. We are under the Department of Culture, Recreation, and Tourism, which is under the Office of the Lieutenant Governor here with the state of Louisiana. So that's the introduction. We are going to go ahead and turn our cameras off now so we can just focus on the presentation. And just like last time, we're going to hold the more in-depth questions until the end of the webinar. We only have about an hour of content, so we'll have plenty of time for questions afterwards. You can drop any questions into the chat. However, if you would like to raise your hand during the presentation, if there's a question that needs immediate assistance, we will be able to unmute you and call on you. All right, so let's begin. So today we're going to go over what the standards are. We are going to then look at the definition of historic character. We're going to review standards 1 through 10, and then we're going to go over some helpful resources. We will start off with Emily.
Okay, so if you've joined us for our first 2 webinars, you've already learned the basics of the tax credit application process and best practices for photographic documentation to accompany those applications. However, filling out the forms correctly and providing adequate documentation is only half a successful tax credit application. To qualify for tax credits, a project must be a certified rehabilitation, meaning the rehabilitation is consistent with the historic character of the building. To determine whether the proposed work maintains the building's historic character, it is reviewed based on 10 overarching principles called the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation, usually abbreviated to SOI standards or just the standards. This means that not all renovations of historic properties will necessarily qualify for tax credits. There are certain guidelines that must be followed. The expectation is that historic features and materials in the building will be retained, and the credit is meant to offset the additional costs this incurs. The Secretary of the Interior has published written standards for 4 different strategies of approaching work to historic properties. These strategies include preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. Although these may seem interchangeable, for the Secretary's purposes, each of these terms has a specific meaning, and the permitted approach for each will be different. Rehabilitation, which is the strategy directly associated with the historic tax credit, is defined as the act or process of making possible a compatible use for a property through repair, alterations, and additions, while preserving those portions or features which convey its historical, cultural, or architectural values. This means that you do not need to maintain the building exactly as is or restore it to its original historic appearance. Changes can be made to the building provided they are sensitive to the overall historic character and any remaining historic features and materials. These standards must be followed on both the exterior and interior of the building. Interior work must also be reviewed and approved to qualify for the tax credit, including both spatial changes to the floor plan and proposed finishes. This is quite different from local historic district regulations, which typically only apply to the exterior of the building. Applying the standards is often one of the most challenging aspects of a historic tax credit project, as they can be interpreted in different ways and may result in different recommendations based on each property's unique characteristics. The standards are purposely written in very broad terms, as they must apply to different building types of all ages and styles across the country, from a colonial farmhouse to an Art Deco skyscraper to a mid-century gas station. Having an understanding of the standards and evaluating proposed changes in this context as you are planning your project will help to ensure a timely review process and a successful Part 2 application. Being able to address how a major alteration complies with the standards can help lead to an approval of your proposal, although ultimately, final interpretation of the standards and decisions as to whether or not a project will meet those standards lies with the official state or federal reviewer. Before we look at the 10 standards, it may be helpful to clarify how a building's historic character is defined, as this is a term that you will hear referred to often in relation to the tax credit process. For our purposes, historic character refers to the visual, tangible aspects that give a building its unique identity and appearance. Historic character can be analyzed by evaluating a building's overall visual character, arm's length visual character, and interior visual character. The next few slides will show examples of characteristics that fall into each of these categories. Overall character refers to the major visual characteristics of the building that can be identified from some distance. For example, when viewing the building from across the street, what features stand out? These can include aspects of overall shape, window and door openings, roof characteristics, projections such as porches, galleries, and bays, trim and decorative details, and the building setting. It is important to evaluate the building setting, not just the actual structure, since the building's character can be greatly influenced by its context. This is why work on the surrounding site and adjacent new construction is reviewed as part of the application, even if the work itself is not eligible to claim the credit. For example, if a building is set back from the street and surrounded by a large lawn, paving over the lawn for a parking lot will impact how the building is perceived and experienced. Arm's length character refers to the visual characteristics that can be discerned from a closer vantage point, essentially when standing arm's length away from the building. These can include both characteristics of the individual materials as well as the specific details used to produce or install the material or feature. For example, when initially describing a building, we might note that it has brick exterior walls. However, there is an immense variety of different brick types that create very different visual effects. We need to go further and evaluate the brick color, dimension, surface texture, bond, or the pattern in which the bricks are laid, and the width, profile, and color of the mortar joints between the bricks. These small details may not seem as important in defining the character as larger features, but they can have an outsized impact on the building's appearance when applied across the entire building surface. Finally, remembering that interior work must also meet the SOI standards dimensionally. Again, changes to details that seem relatively small or less important looks like we had a little hiccup with the audio.
Yeah, I think we're good now. Emily, if you can start back over with interior character.
Okay.
Now
I'll start
I think
from
it was because, yeah, mine disconnected for some reason. Go ahead.
It is important to evaluate the building's interior character. This will include specific decorative features and finishes, such as the marble columns, arched openings, wood beams, paneled doors, and tiled floor and wainscoting seen in the photo on the right. However, the overall size and volume of spaces and how they relate to one another can also contribute to the sense of interior character. Historic character must be evaluated three-dimensionally. Again, changes to details that seem relatively small or less important in the room can still impact the historic integrity of the space. All of these features and elements, overall, arm's length, and interior, give the building its visual character and are often referred to as character-defining features. It is important to remember, however, that historic character is more than the sum of its individual parts. How all these elements combine and interact is what ultimately forms our perception of the building. So let's look at some examples. Pictured are three residential buildings of differing ages and architectural styles. It is probably obvious to all of us that these buildings are very different from one another and therefore have different historic characters. Features and materials that work with one building would look out of place on the others. To define a building's character and its character-defining features, it can be helpful to think about how you would describe what makes a certain building different from another, or what makes two buildings similar. For example, the two-story Queen Anne building on the left and the Creole cottage in the center both have wood trim accents on their exteriors. The trim work on the first building, however, is much more elaborate, while the trim on the second building is comparatively plain, contributing to a simpler style overall. The third building, on the right, doesn't have decorative trim at all. Instead, the design is expressed through the geometry of the exposed wood structure. The context, massing, symmetry, or lack of symmetry, pattern, and detailing of openings, and exterior finishes also vary between each example. Now let's talk about interior character. Very broadly, a building is going to have either an unfinished interior character, such as the large industrial building on the left, or a finished character, such as the two examples to the right. Appropriate interior treatments for a historically unfinished building are likely going to be inappropriate for a historically finished building, and vice versa. It is also important to note that there can be variation within each category. For example, the finished interior in the center is older and more traditional in style, with more decorative elements such as the column capitals and plaster ceiling moldings. The mid-century example at the right also has finished walls, ceilings, and floors, but these finishes are more minimal and lack the decorative embellishments of the center example. While these are both considered finished spaces, the interior character is actually quite different. The most important thing to keep in mind when evaluating changes based on historic character is that you need to work with the building you have. Some buildings, such as the examples on this slide, are very plain or simple in design on the exterior, interior, or both. And that simplicity is a key component of its historic character. Some historic features or finishes may not be desirable in terms of current commercial marketability. However, if they are character defining, they still need to be preserved. Modifications to historic buildings need to be based on the age, style, historic use, and overall character of the property, not on personal preference or to achieve a certain aesthetic intent. Lean into and embrace the unique characteristics that your building has. For rehabilitation projects, interior spaces are typically categorized as primary or secondary, sometimes tertiary. It is essential to identify the primary spaces within your building before beginning to lay out a floor plan. Primary spaces are those that are most important in defining the historic character of a building, and as such, these spaces should be retained or only minimally altered. For most buildings, the primary spaces will be those spaces that are the most public-facing. Think about the entry sequence, meaning how a typical user or visitor would have entered and experienced the building as they progressed from one area to the next. The fewer people who would have accessed a particular space, the less significant it typically would have been. The building's historic use can also help define the primary spaces, particularly in industrial or other buildings that do not have defined public areas. In that case, the most important spaces to the building's function may be the most significant. A secondary space is usually a more simply detailed space with restricted access, such as an office, hotel guest room, or a bedroom, or a utilitarian space that serves a support function, such as a kitchen or bathroom. Secondary spaces can undergo greater change without negatively impacting the building's character. Elevations, or the sides of a building, can also be designated as primary or secondary. Unless the building is on a corner, the primary elevation is typically the front facade. Some buildings, such as churches, theaters, or gymnasiums, contain single large public spaces that accommodate the principal use. These are fairly easy to identify as the primary space of the building. In a residential building, primary spaces will generally be the main entry spaces, like a foyer, as well as entertaining spaces, such as a parlor or formal dining room. In this example, there's an open combined foyer and stair hall that communicates directly with the second floor corridor above. Because of the relationship of that corridor to the main entry below, it would also be considered important. Remember, how different spaces relate to each other can also impact significance. Shotgun buildings are an extremely prevalent housing type in Louisiana. However, they usually don't have defined entryways or entertaining spaces. Typically, in shotgun buildings, the first two rooms are considered the primary spaces, as these are the areas a visitor would typically have encountered, with more private family areas towards the rear. Another factor that can affect the significance of a space is the degree of historic integrity remaining. For example, if a primary space has already been heavily altered, there may be more flexibility in making additional alterations. The second room on the left side of this double shotgun was previously altered with the addition of a non-historic hallway and removal of the large opening connecting it with the front room. Because its historic integrity has already been significantly impacted, it no longer holds the same level of importance. Conversely, if a building has lost a lot of its historic integrity, a secondary space can become more important if it retains more historic fabric or is more intact than the rest of the building. For traditional commercial buildings such as offices and hotels, primary spaces will encompass main circulation areas such as entry lobbies, corridors, stairwells, and elevator lobbies, as well as any important assembly spaces such as boardrooms or ballrooms. Circulation paths such as corridors are generally considered to be significant, even on upper floors, as these are the areas that would have been experienced by the greatest number of people and form the basis of a visitor's experience and impressions of a building. In this example of a historic school building, the main entry corridor, double-loaded classroom corridors on both floors, and the stairs connecting the two floors at both ends are all primary. The classrooms would be considered secondary space and are more flexible in terms of making modifications. In school buildings, assembly spaces such as cafeterias, gymnasiums, or auditoriums could also be considered primary spaces. These are some common examples, but the primary spaces in each building will depend on how that particular building was used. So before moving on to the standards, let's pause and see if there are any questions so far on historic character or primary spaces. Doesn't look like there are any.
Okay, so we'll start with standard 1, which is compatibility. A property shall be used for its historic purpose or be placed in a new use that requires minimal change to the defining characteristics of the building and its site and environment. When planning the use of your building after rehabilitation, keep in mind that the use should be compatible with the building's historical use. While the standards do allow for new use, the feel of the historical use should still exist. For example, if the building was a warehouse historically, but the new use is a food hall, the ceilings of the food hall should not be covered and should be left exposed. The building should feel like an old warehouse that was adapted and rehabilitated for a new use. The image on the left is an old Sears building that was converted into a shopping center and food hall and apartments. With the new use, the entire site should also have minimal change. This means that building a large modern building right in front of this old Sears building would not be an appropriate new use. We will touch on new additions later, but the site should not have any new structures that overpower the historic one. On the right, we have a fire station that was adapted into an arts facility. And you can see in the middle, the original fire pole exists, giving the public a reminder of the building's historic use. So we aren't completely removing that historic character that was mentioned before. The next few images show before and afters of a concrete block mid-century warehouse. The warehouse was historically very open with the ceiling framework exposed, which was character defining. The proposed new use was an office space. You can see here in the after photos that the new office spaces do not overpower the warehouse feel of the space. The key thing to remember is that the building should retain historic elements or features when a rehabilitation project is undertaken. So the key features here would be the ceilings. And like I said on the previous slide, the key feature was a fire pole. Standard number 2, historic character. Historic character of a property shall be retained and preserved. The removal of historic materials or alteration of features and spaces that characterize a property shall be avoided. Character defining features should be retained, especially if there's little historic fabric remaining. Historic fabric can mean anything from the layout itself to the decorative fireplace. You can see here on the left, the primary spaces, which are the 2 front rooms, were not altered. And even though bathrooms were added to the center of the floor plan, the shotgun feel is still very clear. The images on the right show significant changes to the shotgun layout, which is something that we want to avoid. Finishes should also be taken into consideration when determining historic character. If the brick, interior or exterior, had finishes historically, then leaving the brick exposed is not an appropriate treatment per standard number 2. The images here show a fireplace and a staircase covered with brick and plaster in the before photos. While the exposed brick is a modern practice, it differs from the original historic character of the staircase and fireplace. The decorative tile flooring in the middle image is a finish that is character defining. It is also located in a primary space of the building. This is something the public would have seen when they first walked into the building. The elevators in the background. So replacing this decorative tile with wood or carpet would not be appropriate. Lastly, there are less obvious features such as wood paneling on the right. If a building had a large amount of wood paneling, especially in a primary space, this would be considered a character-defining feature. Removing all of the wood paneling from a historic building's lobby would not be appropriate. The brick fireplace An enclosed transom shown in the examples to follow are character-defining features that may often be overlooked. You might want to paint this brick, which would not be appropriate if it wasn't already painted. Next slide. You might want to remove this transom altogether, and it's white, so it kind of blends into the walls at first glance, but that is a character defining feature, the transom window that is currently closed. Just another angle. Sure. We'll move on to standard 3.
All right, standard 3, physical record. Standard 3 states that each property shall be recognized as a physical record of its time, place, and use. Changes that create a false sense of historical development, such as adding conjectural features or architectural elements from other buildings, shall not be undertaken. So with this standard, we discussed the concepts of alterations without historical basis and recognizing the historical period in which a building was constructed when designing new features. We have already discussed how alterations to a building must not alter the historic character of a building. And this includes adding elements that may seem appropriate because they are visible on other parts of a building or on similar buildings, but for which there is no evidence that these features existed on this specific building. We refer to this as conjecture, which means doing something based on how it seems it should be, but not based on evidence. When a feature is missing and there is no physical or pictorial evidence, a compatible new or replacement feature should be designed that takes into consideration the historic use and the remaining evidence. Here we have an example of an early 20th century warehouse that had some previous alterations, including adding a central doorway and small awning, and also inserting a recessed glass storefront into the loading bay on the left. Historically, the warehouse would have been entered through a secondary elevation where there were simple arched openings in the masonry and through the loading dock on the facade. The goal of the rehabilitation was to create an accessible storefront and refocus the main entrance to the front of the building. During the rehabilitation, the arched openings on the side and rear were replicated on the facade, and the loading bay was infilled, and a newly recessed entrance was added at the center. Additionally, a heavy cornice was added to the parapet. This treatment resulted in a false sense of historic appearance and did not meet standard 3. In addition to adding conjectural features, standard 3 addresses making alterations without historical basis. This standard requires us to first evaluate the historic period within which the building was constructed and determine what character-defining features are still extant from this period. From there, we can then evaluate the proposed changes. This particular building is a circa 1920s corner store. It has been altered, but still retains its general form and some character-defining features. These include the clipped corner entrance, the gallery and low-pitched hipped roof, and on the side elevations, the original fenestration pattern and bay on the second floor. Alterations to the building included a new storefront windows on both the facade and the ground floor side elevation, updated openings onto the front gallery, and replacement windows throughout. So now that we have evaluated the building in the context of its historic period, we can then review the proposed alterations. Here we have the initial design that was presented. The proposal included removing the clip corner entry, relocating the entrance and replacing the entire storefront. Gallery openings were replaced with ornate French doors with side lights and transoms, which is very different from the existing condition. And there was no evidence that this building had these types of openings. The design appeared to be incompatible with the age of the building. And on the side elevation, the proposal was to alter the fenestration pattern, replacing paired windows with single windows. After a meeting with the applicant, a new design was developed. which was much more compatible with the building. The clipped corner entrance was retained, and the openings were simplified, including those on the second floor gallery. The one remaining issue was with the windows on the side elevation, and so we were able to simply add a condition that the fenestration pattern needed to be maintained, but we were otherwise able to approve the project. Standard 4, acquired significance. Standard 4 recognizes that most properties change over time. Those changes that have acquired significance in their own right shall be retained and preserved in order for alterations to a historic building. In order for alterations to a historic building to have acquired significance, those alterations must have been made within the district's period of significance and must have had a clear design intent and a high level of craftsmanship and detail. In other words, not all changes to a historic building that happened a long time ago have acquired significance. But when they are determined to be significant or historically important, then these changes must be preserved. Here we have an example of an 1880s commercial row building that was altered circa 1950 with a mid-century slipcover. In this case, the period of significance for the district extended to 1970 and therefore included this mid-century design in the overall significance of the district. The applicant was able to provide evidence that the building had Italianate features to match the adjacent row building. And from the rear perspective, you can see that these were all built as sister buildings. Therefore, the applicant proposed to restore the 19th century details and remove the circa 1950 slipcover. While the proposed design is rooted in the building's historical construction period and was based on some evidence, which are the two issues we covered in the previous standard, it did not meet SOI standards because the existing 1950s exterior had acquired significance. It was added within the district's period of significance and had a very clear design intent. Therefore, this proposal was not approved, and the applicant changed their proposal to restore the 1950s slipcover. If the 19th century facade had been restored, it would have been a replica with new materials. But instead, by using this approach, we were able to restore a facade that had acquired significance and therefore actually retain historic material rather than replicating. Standard 5, preserving craftsmanship. Standard 5 involves preserving craftsmanship. It reads, distinctive features, finishes, and construction techniques or examples of craftsmanship that characterize a property shall be preserved. This standard is fairly straightforward because it refers to all the things that make historic buildings so unique. And in most cases, these are the elements that everyone wants to see preserved. This includes the high-level detailing on the porch, the elaborate lead glass windows, ornate plasterwork, but it also refers to simple elements like wood windows, trim, siding, and chimneys. Details are important and often the most overlooked. In this example, we have a situation where a Greek Revival townhouse was rehabilitated. The interior did have significant damage and deterioration, but the historic trim and interior transoms were intact. During the rehabilitation, these features were replaced and the historic trim was removed. Additionally, transom sashes were removed and not reinstalled. The trim and transoms are examples of craftsmanship that should have been preserved, and this project, in the end, required remediation. Craftsmanship can also refer to finishes, like stained wood. Stained wood trim contributes to the character of a space, but also represents original craftsmanship that went into the building design. Painting this trim not only alters the character of the space, but damages the original craftsman detail and is very difficult to reverse. For this reason, painting previously unpainted surfaces can result in project denial. So picture in chair rails, flooring and baseboards, stairs, railings, chimneys, mantles, as well as finishes like stained wood, are all examples of important craftsmanship that should be preserved. And as you will see in the next standard, must be repaired if possible, or if not, properly replaced.
Standard number 6 is repair. Deteriorated historic features shall be repaired rather than replaced. Where the severity of deterioration requires placement of a distinctive feature, the new feature shall match the old in design, color, texture, and other visual qualities and, where possible, materials. Replacement of missing features shall be substantiated by documentary, physical, or pictorial evidence. Historic features should be repaired as best as possible. Replacement should only be considered when the damage is beyond repair. In this example, the wood siding on the left has a narrow exposure and is thicker than the fiber cement siding on the right. The new fiber cement siding does not look the same as the old wood siding. It has a flatter appearance. When applied in large sections, a change like this could have an impact on the building's character. Here you can see a theater ceiling that was repaired. Tiny details and color patterns, such as the one shown here, should be replaced with light colors rather than replaced altogether. So this theater ceiling was severely damaged. You want to try your hardest to replace everything within light colors other than like replacing it altogether because of all of the details on this ceiling. The image in the middle shows windows that would have been wood historically, but they were too damaged to repair. Although the new windows are aluminum clad, the replacement material is appropriate and the design matches what would have been there historically. The image on the right shows a 4/4 window replacement used with the same materials as the middle window. This is why design, color, texture, and other visual qualities should all be taken into consideration. Replacing the window on the right with an appropriate material, but not an appropriate design, would not meet the standards. So you want to make sure you're replacing 2/1 windows with 2/1 windows, 6/6 with 6/6, and double hung, and all of that. If you do not know what was there historically, historical photos or research can help with your project. Replacement material options will be reviewed by our office when you submit your Part 2 application. Preservation brief number 9 states that the decision process for selecting replacement windows should not begin with a survey of contemporary window products which are available as replacements, but should begin with a look at the windows which are being replaced. Attempt to understand the contribution of the windows to the appearance of the facade, including 1, the pattern of the openings and their size, 2, portions of the frame and the sash, 3, configuration of window panes, 4, Munson profiles, 5, type of wood, 6, paint color, 7, characteristics of the glass, and 8, associated details such as arched tops, hoods, and other decorative elements. Develop an understanding of how the window reflects the period, style, or regional characteristics of the building, or represents technological development. Here are a few more before and after of wood windows that were repaired with like materials, so you'll see the patchwork on the left was repaired. So it's not too damaged to where it needed to be replaced. And then the images on the right, before and afters, if you see that image where the arrow is, the window is kind of sticking out a bit, but that was able to be repaired. And they also repainted. So this brings us to our next standard discussing cleaning materials. Standard number 7, cleaning and chemical treatments. Chemical or physical treatments such as sandblasting that cause damage to historic materials shall not be used. The surface cleaning of structures, if appropriate, shall be undertaken using the gentlest means possible. Oftentimes, cleaning is a huge part of the rehabilitation process. Cleaning measurements should not damage the historic buildings. Sandblasting is a common method that damages historic fabric. As seen here, these 3 images are examples of brick damaged from sandblasting. So the images do look different because the brick is different, but they've all been damaged by sandblasting. This brick is very delicate. Standards 6 and 7 often work hand in hand because cleaning can be a part of repairing. Blasting causes damage to very soft materials such as brick and terracotta. Plaster and stucco are even softer and will likely be removed entirely from the sandblasting, unless the intention is to remove the plaster or stucco to reveal the material that's underneath. It should not be used. As quoted in Preservation Brief 6, sometimes it is acceptable to clean rough-cut granite, limestone, or sandstone having a heavy dirt incrustation by using the wet grit method, whereby a small amount of abrasive material is injected into a controlled, pressurized water stream. However, this technique requires very careful supervision in order to prevent damage to the stone. Wood and soft metals such as tin, zinc, lead, copper, and aluminum are other materials that will be damaged from sandblasting. The Preservation Brief 6 also states that the gentlest means possible of removing dirt from a building surface can be achieved by using a low-pressure water wash, scrubbing areas of more persistent grime with a natural bristle, never metal, brush. Steam cleaning can also be used effectively to clean some historic building fabric. Low-pressure water or steam will soften the dirt and cause the deposits to rise to the surface where they can be washed away. Overall, abrasive materials are not appropriate for cleaning historic material.
So now we'll move on to Standard 8, which is about archaeology. Archaeological resources will be protected and preserved in place. If such resources must be disturbed, mitigation measures will be undertaken. While this is not a standard that we generally use in our project review, it is still important to consider, especially when working at historic sites. Standards 9 and 10 have to do with new additions. Standard 9 states that new additions, exterior alterations, or related new construction will not destroy historic materials, features, and spatial relationships that characterize the property. The new work will be differentiated from the old and will be compatible with the historic materials, features, size, scale, and proportion, and massing to protect the integrity of the property and its environment. Standard 10, which goes hand in hand with Standard 9, states that new additions and adjacent or related new construction shall be undertaken in such a manner that if removed in the future, the essential form and integrity of the historic property and its environment will be unimpaired. Here you see examples of new additions which have been compatibly designed and scaled, and 2 examples of what we call a hyphen, which connects a new addition to an old building in the most minimal way possible, clearly differentiating the 2 and ensuring that the new addition can be removed without damage to the historic building. The next example is of a historic school that was required to add circulation in order to meet code. The new circulation tower on this building was attached to the building by a narrow bridge, only requiring a few new door openings. The addition and bridge could be removed and the building restored to its original state very easily. It did not require the destruction of historic fabric. In addition, the massing is compatible. It's even much lower than the historic building's roof line, so it is not visible from the front of the property. Now we will discuss visibility. In conjunction with appropriate massing, proportion, and scale, we will evaluate the visibility of any addition. In doing so, we want to ensure that the historic building is still the main focal point, not overshadowed by any addition. This usually means that they should be no taller than the existing building and located on a secondary elevation and have minimal visibility. Here you see an example of a Creole cottage, which we might assume could not support a new addition without compromising the historic character. However, due to its height and placement on the lot, this two-story addition has little to no visibility from the street and was able to be kept slightly lower than the height of the cottage. Additionally, it was differentiated in style while also being compatible. One of the most common types of additions that we see in urban areas especially are rooftop additions. The roof line is often an important character defining feature, and a successful rooftop addition should not alter the building's historic characteristics. Whether or not a building can support a rooftop addition depends on a variety of factors, including the height of the building, how the building is situated on the lot, the width of the streets. In most cases, buildings 3 stories or less are not tall enough to support a rooftop addition. In order for an addition to meet the standards, it generally will have to be set back from the facade, must be subordinate to the historic building, and compatible in materials. Here on the left, you see an example of a compatible rooftop addition, which has very minimal visibility and does not alter the historic roof line. And on the right, you see an example of a rooftop addition that not only has high visibility, but also was constructed with incompatible materials. In order to determine visibility, we will often request a mock-up be constructed to simulate the height and location of the addition, and this be photographed from the street view. While graphic renderings are very helpful to evaluate new construction, determining visibility is still better achieved by providing a more concrete simulation that can be evaluated through street-level photographs. You could expect to provide this in most cases where rooftop additions are proposed. Here you see the process of constructing a rooftop mock-up and providing the necessary photographs. After some modifications to the proposed location, this is a very rare example of where an addition was approved on a single-story structure, largely due to the tall parapet and the ability to shift the addition far enough back on the roof to have minimal to no visibility. In conclusion, additions to historic buildings shall be differentiated, compatible, subordinate to the historic building, removable, and have minimal visibility. And most importantly, the thread that runs through all 10 of these standards must not alter the building's historic character.
The standards seem fairly straightforward in theory, but interpreting how they apply to specific work items can be challenging. This is where having an experienced tax credit consultant who understands what is and is not likely to be approved can be helpful, even more so than the completion of the actual applications. If you do not have a consultant, you can also find more focused guidance on the Technical Preservation Services website, including the preservation briefs that were shown earlier and additional bulletins related to specific topics, such as replacement windows, rooftop additions, new storefronts, and so on. The TPS website can be accessed via the link on the screen, www.mps.gov/subjects/tax incentives. On the website, you can find the Preservation by Topic Index. The link to the index is circled in red at the bottom right of the screen. This index allows you to search more specific topics, which are listed alphabetically. The beginning of the A section is shown here. For example, under accessibility, you can find additional guidance on how to improve the accessibility of historic structures while maintaining the building's historic character. There are many more topics that can be found on this page. Some additional examples are shown on the right. Again, this additional guidance is not going to be prescriptive, but it does specify best practices and issues to consider, as well as provides case study examples. This will help you to anticipate the criteria that we and MPS are going to use to evaluate these specific modifications. The National Park Service also regularly updates existing guidance or publishes new guidance to respond to common issues that are currently being encountered with tax credit projects. Recent publications include an update to Preservation Brief 16 on the use of substitute materials on historic building exteriors, and new guidance on the treatment of historic acoustical panel ceilings in mid-century building conversions. If you're interested, make sure to sign up for the TPS newsletter to be informed of these publications as they become available. If you have questions over whether or not something you're proposing to do would meet the standards or need advice on how to handle a specific condition, our staff is happy to answer questions, provide preliminary feedback, and perform site visits. Although nothing can be officially approved before the full Part 2 application is received and reviewed, we can provide guidance to avoid investing too much time or money in pursuing a proposal that ultimately would get denied. For more information, you can check out our website at louisianahp.org or follow us on Instagram at Louisiana_HP.
All right, that is the end of our content. Thank you all for joining us today. Before we take questions, I just want to let you know that our first webinar is available for viewing, and our next webinar is available for registration. So you can go to our website and register for that on November 13th. The topic will cover Part 2 applications and work descriptions. We will address how to effectively describe a project in the required format, how to reference photographs, what types of architectural drawings are required, and we will also discuss how to amend a project using the amendment form. And with that, we will open the floor for questions. You can raise your hand and we will try to call on you and unmute you, or you can just put them in the chat. Reading one question from Michael Reed. What is the SOI standard for painted brick? Should paint analysis be done to find out when the brick was painted? And if so, how long the time frame should the brick have been painted, 10 years, 20 years, etc.? Or should it be period specific based on the project? So the main issue with painting brick is removing paint once it's applied. So if you have a building that has paint on the masonry already, the best approach is probably just to maintain it. What we would not want to see is you painting unpainted brick. So even if the brick was painted not that long ago, we would still like to just see it kept painted because the harm that can happen by removing the paint. He also asked a question, can you change the stain of wood trim and floors? For example, changing the stain from espresso to early American. So yes, you can change the color of the stain. You just cannot paint it. Okay, so Brooke is asking again to explain the importance of changes made during the period of significance. Are all changes important, or is there more of a gray area? So if you go back to that acquired significance section, not all changes made to a building, even those done during the period of significance, have acquired significance. So in order for those changes to have acquired significance, they must have been done with a specific design intent, and they must have be kind of quality changes. So that's what we're going to be looking at, high level of craftsmanship and detail. That would be something that would then make that change have acquired significance. So there is a gray area there. Right, and I don't see any more questions, but you all know where to find us, so feel free to reach out to us if you do have any other questions. Oh, we got one real quick. Regarding lead-based paints, when is its removal required? So we would never require the removal of lead-based paints. We would prefer encapsulation. Usually encapsulation is a method that is approved by even, code. However, that's not always the case. We've had rare circumstances. The ones I'm thinking of are at school buildings where they had to remove the lead paint because of the risks to the children. So in those cases, we worked with them to remove and appropriately apply new paint. So we do not require the removal of lead paint because encapsulation is generally a preferred method. Not seeing anything else. So thank you all again for joining us. We really appreciate you all listening to us, and of course, reach out to us with any questions. And until then, we will see you next month for the next webinar. Thank you.